The big OSHA mandate is dead, probably for now, meaning forever. The healthcare vaccine mandate for healthcare workers is alive. So we got to be concerned about those Americans because their liberty is restricted now in a way it wasn't restricted 2 days ago. The other big news this week is, are the Supreme Court decisions related to the Biden vaccine mandates. Now, before the court were two big questions, and I guess there were two separate cases because I have two separate opinions. One was a vaccine mandate issued by OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, that required more or less employers with 100 or more employees to put into place a vaccine mandate. It was either you have a mandate or then you had some sort of crazy, if you didn't have the mandate, some crazy testing regime that was completely harassing. And as the Supreme Court ruled that the challenge to that is likely to succeed, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, and they allowed a stay issued by the lower court, which essentially is stopping the mandate from being implemented, to continue. So the big Biden vaccine mandate is dead for now, and it's unlikely to be resurrected, at least in its current form. Big victory for the rule of law, big victory for the Constitution. It was 6-3. So all of the Republican appointees, the conservatives on the court, or not so conservatives on the court, depending on your point of view, voted to stay the vaccine mandate. And the three leftists on the court obviously supported this unprecedented attack on the rights of American citizens by requiring to engage and take a medical treatment that's irreversible. And there's some key lines I'd like to review with you. And I encourage you to look at both decisions. They're available on the Supreme Court's website. And it gives you an idea of what the fight was about. And I want to say before I get into the detail here, the fight wasn't about the core constitutional issues that many of us are concerned about when you have governments either at the federal, state, or local level impose vaccine mandates. It was about whether the federal laws that Biden was using to justify his vaccine mandates allowed him to do what he suggested he had the power to do. And they found in the case of the law governing OSHA, he didn't. And this is kind of the craziness of it. They were purporting to cover, I may have said this already, 84.2 million Americans with this mandate. And as the court said, they were kind of painting with a broad brush. The regulation operates as a blunt instrument. It draws no distinction based on industry or risk of exposure to COVID-19. Thus, most lifeguards and linemen face the same regulations as do medics and meat packers. And as I said, 84.2 million covered. And they're using the so-called emergency standard regulation that OSHA has in its rules and it's the law governing its powers as an excuse and pretext to impose this mandate. And the thinking is, look, if there's an emergency issue in a workplace, for instance, a dangerous chemical, they can impose a specific mandate on a specific company or a specific industry that's narrowly tailored. And the concern that the conservatives on the court had is, if the Congress intended OSHA to allow this unprecedented assertion of power over 85 million people, Congress would have written it more explicitly. And you just can't pretend that a law that allows you to act in narrow circumstances allows you to act, practically speaking, without any notice or comment in this radical and extreme measure. And this is what would happen. Unvaccinated employees who do not comply with OSHA's rule must be removed from the workplace. Radical. And this wasn't an act that took place or activities that took place solely at work where there was a specific hazard and you needed to wear a hard hat or something. They were telling employees that in order to continue working, you had to submit to testing or more importantly, that employers could use the law to require vaccinations, medical treatment, as Justice Alito said in another case. Employers who've committed violations were facing up to $13,000 for a standard violation and $136,000 for a willful one. So it would have decimated companies who refused to comply. And this is the key quote. Applicants are likely to succeed on the merits of their claim. And that's kind of the standard for, issuing an injunction or a stay of this nature, or one of the standards. On the merits of their claim that the Secretary lacked authority to impose the mandate. Administrative agencies are creatures of statute, meaning law, written law. They accordingly possess only the authority that Congress has provided. The Secretary has ordered 84 million Americans to either obtain a COVID-19 vaccine or undergo weekly medical testing at their own expense. This is no everyday exercise of federal power, the court writes. It is instead a significant encroachment into the lives and health of a vast number of employees. And this is a quoting from another case. We expect Congress to speak clearly when authorizing an agency to exercise powers of vast economic and political significance. There can be little doubt that OSHA's mandate qualifies as an exercise of such authority and therefore is unlawful and contrary to, in my view, the Constitution at least. But you see that in that decision. What's the mirror of that language? Is that Biden was trying to be a dictator. He was acting as a despot. He was issuing law. He was issuing regulations by fiat that had no basis in the Constitution or his authority as President of the United States. He's supposed to enforce the laws. He can't write them and make them up as he goes along. And we went from, it was bad under Obama with a pen and a phone. And sometimes Trump, he kind of pushed the boundaries of executive decision-making and authority. Biden, he's completely out of control. And thankfully, under our system of government, the courts are doing some good work in keeping him under control, because this vaccine mandate would have been an extraordinary expansion of executive power that would have eviscerated constitutional controls on the presidency in a way that would have put all of our civil rights and our personal liberties at risk every time there was, quote, an emergency that Biden thought he needed to, or someone else thought he needed to act to thwart. So that was a great decision. And then concurrently, at the same time, they issued another decision that was not a great decision. This was on another Biden vaccine mandate issued by the Health and Human Services related to Medicare and Medicaid programs. And the Secretary announced that in order to receive Medicare and Medicaid funding, participating facilities must ensure that their staff, unless exempt for medical or religious reasons, are vaccinated against COVID-19. Now, in this case, the lower courts correctly enjoined the rule, stayed it, stopped it, but the Biden administration appealed, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court removed the stay so the policy can move forward. Justices Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Robert agreed with the three leftists to allow HHS to again exercise unprecedented power to require anyone who works in medical facilities, and I'm not quite sure the specifics of what's covered there in terms of what qualifies as a facility that's covered under this definition of Medicare or Medicaid funding. But depending on the numbers, it's either 10 or 17 million people. Either way, it's too many Americans who are under the thumb of the government now as a result of this decision. It was a close decision. The other one was 6-3. This one was 5-4. And thankfully, I don't know, maybe the record underneath, this doesn't end the case because the case can continue to litigate. It certainly doesn't augur well for the challengers who are seeking to defend and vindicate the liberty of citizens who work in these healthcare settings. But maybe they'll fix it. And they'll come up with information that persuades the court to change its mind in this regard when it ultimately, if it does, rule on the merits. And this is the heart of it here. And I encourage you to read the full dissents. Today's decision, because one of the things they did, again, was issue this emergency ruling. An emergency that took place almost a year after the vaccines were made available. So all of a sudden it became an emergency. Everyone had a vaccine, and therefore they didn't have to follow the normal procedures. Today's decision will ripple through administrative agencies' future decision-making. The executive branch already touches nearly every aspect of Americans' lives, and concluding that CMS, which is the the health agency at the federal level that issued this, had good cause to avoid notice and comment rulemaking, the court shifts the presumption against compliance with procedural strictures from the unelected agency to the people they regulate. So typically, when a regulation of this nature is issued, and given its wide applicability and dramatic change in the relationship between government and the American people, it's typically subject, in the least, assuming that there's any authority to even consider issuing it, to notice and comment so the American people can respond. And the agency by law is supposed to respond to those concerns. They didn't do that here. Neither the agency nor the court, meaning the 5 justices who upheld this abuse, articulates a limiting principle for why, after an unexplained and unjustified delay, an agency can regulate first and listen later. And this is just tremendous language, and I encourage you to remember it and use it. And then put more than 10 million healthcare workers to the choice of their jobs or irreversible medical treatment. Now, how can I improve on that? So that's where we stand. The big OSHA mandate is dead, probably for now, meaning forever. The healthcare vaccine mandate for healthcare workers is alive. So we got to be concerned about those Americans because their liberty is restricted now in a way it wasn't restricted 2 days ago. The good news is 85 million Americans are freer today than they were 2 days ago. And there are other vaccine mandates that Biden has issued that are still before the courts, related to federal employees, related to contractors. So if there's one contract that you have with the government, no matter your circumstances, there's a vaccine mandate tied to it. And then, of course, are always abused by the left, military, are facing abusive vaccine mandates. So there are constitutional issues, and I'm not going to lecture you as to what they are. It's called freedom, liberty. You have core rights in your person that are protected by the Constitution. And in this case, the courts didn't even really get to whether these regulations made any sense scientifically. And I'm hoping the lower courts get to that because I don't think they could survive any rational analysis. I mean, it's one thing to have the Supreme Court say, there's this health emergency and everyone thinks this vaccine works, and therefore we're going to allow the government to require people in healthcare settings use it to protect themselves and patients. Well, what if the vaccine doesn't work? I mean, the news is from Fauci this week, everyone's going to get COVID. at least the Omicron version of it. How does the vaccine mandate stand up under that logic? And the government can't go and tell you, you need to start flapping your arms before you go to work because it makes you safer. There's got to, obviously that's absurd. And no court's going to uphold that. And I hope that's the case with this vaccine mandate. So what is Judicial Watch doing? Well, we're doing something the government hates, which is asking questions about how they approve the vaccines to begin with. As I've discussed here previously, the American people have a right to know about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, especially in light of their government, in the case of the Biden administration, deciding to impose vaccine mandates on entire swaths of the population. And so what Judicial Watch is doing is that we have litigation and Freedom of Information Act requests to try to get more information about what went on in terms of how the vaccine was developed and just basic information and basic data that, contrary to what the government and its media allies tell you, hasn't been made public, as in our view, the law requires. So we will try to vindicate the rule of law, obviously, generally on vaccine mandates, while holding the government accountable for how they created this in a way that may place people at harm or just raise questions about the processes that the American people just have a right to know anyway, because it's their government.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.